know it's the $1 million question that everyone wants to know what the answer is. And the reality is, it's too early to tell. The Biden administration has been in government for just little over a month. And many of their key appointees to run cabinet agencies like the Commerce Department are not yet in place. They haven't been confirmed by the Senate. They're going to conduct a number of reviews of what past policies and practices were by the last administration. And some of that's going to take some time for them to conduct those reviews and conclude which policies do they want to continue, which policies do they want to change, and which policies maybe do they want to eliminate. So right now it's still a question mark. I would say, from reading what the White House has said publicly, they have signaled, though, that in some areas they still do maintain some concerns with regards to national security related issues, whether it's 5G or artificial intelligence. So I do think the Biden administration is likely still going to share some of the concerns that the Trump administration did. But, from the semiconductor industry, from the perspective of the business sector, our hope is they go about that in a much smarter approach. In the last 4 years, the U.S. semiconductor industry, we were pretty disappointed in the way many of these policies were implemented. They oftentimes didn't allow for the U.S. private sector companies to provide input. We weren't given advance notice before many of these rules and regulations were implemented. And furthermore, our sense was that sometimes they ended up just being a bit too broad. While protecting national security for any government is a very important issue, and it must be taken seriously by government agencies, at the same time, they need to think carefully about what are some of the unintended consequences that some of their actions might have on supply chains, on the private sector, on the economy. And I think, from the perspective of private companies, there really should be a very careful consideration of what those impacts may be before the government takes actions to protect national security. So our hope and our recommendations to the Biden administration with regards to export control is that they take a more narrow focused approach and only focus on technologies and end users that truly have a direct relation to national security, that they fully consider the impact of those rules and regulations on the supply chains in the private sector in the economy before taking action. And ideally, the Biden administration should work together globally in multinational forums, like, for example, the Wassenaar Arrangement, not take action on its own, because sometimes that's just sort of like shooting yourself in the foot. You end up restricting your own companies and actually don't do anything to address the issue of other countries who might be continuing to sell the same technology. So again, our hope is that the Biden administration can take a more narrow approach to export control. But stepping back, our hope is that the U.S. and China, at a political level, at an economic level, can find a more constructive path forward. Can find a way to sit down and talk about some of their differences and manage those differences in a way that brings more predictability and stability to our global economy. Certainly, no one benefits in the private sector by having the U.S. and China or any other country in some sort of prolonged trade conflict. That's certainly not good for cross-border commerce, and it's not good for the semiconductor industry. So we would like to see the U.S. and China sit down and negotiate and find a way to work out some of their differences, and hopefully also find areas for cooperation. There's so much opportunity between our two countries, even in the semiconductor industry, whether it's collaborating to do things like innovating new chips for smart agriculture, or finding ways to manage batteries better so that we have smarter electric vehicles that help us fight climate change, or partnering between U.S. chip companies and Chinese medical device firms so that we have better, cheaper, more power efficient medical devices that can help save lives. We think there's just a tremendous amount of opportunity that can and should happen between the private sector, even in the semiconductor industry. What happened yesterday is the President Biden signed an executive order to conduct a 100-day review of threats and vulnerabilities to the U.S. semiconductor supply chain. They did not mention China, nor did they talk about building a non-Chinese supply chain, and they didn't talk about decoupling. The SIA and the semiconductor industry in the United States, we rely on global supply chains, and our supply chains, no matter what policymakers like to think in Washington, are still going to run through China. China is one of the largest markets for semiconductor chips. It's one of the fastest growing markets for things like 5G, autonomous vehicles, medical devices, all sorts of innovative technologies that are just bristling with semiconductors. So we're not going to, and we shouldn't, decouple from the China market. And that's not our understanding of what this supply chain review is intended to do. Rather, per the White House document that was released yesterday, it's to look at, from a global perspective, what are some of the critical bottlenecks, shortages, and other vulnerabilities that the supply chain globally exists in the semiconductor industry. And so the SIA and the semiconductor industry, we support that initiative to take a scientific approach to analyze what some of those challenges may be for the semiconductor industry and help us think more strategically where the U.S. government should channel some strategic investments. So this is what, something that we think is a very positive development, and we support it very much so. One thing that's really important is that U.S. semiconductor companies are incredibly reliant on research and development to maintain their technological lead. In fact, on average, U.S. semiconductor companies invest about 17% of their revenue back into R&D, and last year that was a total of $40 billion US. And if you think about that, because U.S. chip companies rely on global markets, including the China market, that revenue that U.S. companies are able to obtain from foreign markets, they take, reinvest back into research development. It helps them maintain their lead. And the vast majority of chips that U.S. companies design, manufacture, and sell, are commodity chips that go into your toaster, your car, your flat panel display, your smartphone. And the reality is those don't have any relationship to national security. And so, in that statement that you mentioned, it's the SIA view that those kind of chips that are not very advanced and they only power consumer applications, we don't think they have a relationship to national security. And we think U.S. semiconductor companies, or any company globally, should be able to export them overseas. Whether or not 5G is a national security item, that's really not the place of the private sector to make that kind of determination. That's something that the governments look at and decide what kind of technology might pose national security risks, what kind of technology does not. Certainly in the private sector, we have our own view. We think these consumer technologies that go into mobile handsets and flat panel displays don't have a security risk. But on 5G, we also can't deny that there's been a lot of debate and discussion, and you might have noticed that policymakers that are both Democrats and Republicans, they think 5G is really important, and there's been a big focus on it by governments, not just in the United States, but in Europe and Japan, even in China, as my understanding is, places a big strategic focus on 5G, and as part of that, some of the largest 5G networks in the world are in China, which is, of course, a very incredible development and important for the semiconductor industry. Workforce is really important for the semiconductor industry. In the United States alone, the U.S. semiconductor industry employs around 250,000 workers. And that stems all the way from the factory technician, who might have an associate technical degree, to the PhDs and the postdoctorates that are working on advanced research problems like quantum and neuromorphic computing. And what's really important also is that talent is inherently global. And for a semiconductor company to be successful, they need to be able to attract talent from all different countries. And as you know, the United States has some of the best universities and research institutions in the world. And that over the last several decades has attracted all sorts of bright, young, talented engineers. Unfortunately, over the last couple years, it's been increasingly difficult for some of those overseas students to stay and work in the United States. And our hope is that the U.S. government, the Congress, and the White House can work together to be able to create more opportunities for foreign students who want to stay and work in the United States to stay here so they can help power innovation. In addition to that, the U.S. needs to also focus on encouraging interest in the semiconductor industry at a very early age amongst its own students here in the United States. We felt it was really important for policymakers and the public generally to understand that, in particular for semiconductor manufacturing, this is a very capital intensive industry. There's huge costs involved. A new advanced logic foundry can be well over $20 billion at the 5 nanometer and below node. And what's really important when companies decide when and where to build a fab, first, of course, is market demand. And companies are always going to be building fabs based upon what they think is going to be an increase in demand for their semiconductor devices, whether it's mobile phones, whether it's AI, whether it's 5G communications. That's really the most important factor in terms of when companies decide to build fabs, is if they project an increase in demand. But where they build the fab, there's a lot of other factors that come into play. For example, whether or not there's good utilities, water, infrastructure, whether or not there's good intellectual property protection so that these valuable assets and trade secrets will be protected. In addition, whether or not there's a good pipeline of talent coming from universities, PhDs who can help develop the next generation of technology. But in addition to that, there are many governments around the world that provide incentives for semiconductor manufacturing companies to build fabs in their countries. And unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, the United States, at least at the federal level, has really not offered similar incentives. And increasingly, as semiconductors are becoming a more important topic by governments, we get a lot of questions. Why are more fabs built outside of the United States than inside? And we felt it was really important to try and answer that question with the Boston Consulting Group together in this joint report. And we found, as a conclusion, that one of the major differences between building a fab in the United States and in other countries is that the United States does not offer those incentives for semiconductor manufacturing. In fact, because of that lack of federal government incentives, building and operating an advanced fab in the United States might be 28% more expensive than it would be in other parts of Asia. Even some parts of Europe, for example, are more cost competitive because governments offer some of these incentives. And so again, we felt it was really important to highlight this trend so that policymakers understand for this strategic industry, if they want to embrace a pro-competition strategy, there should be a good incentive policy to encourage that kind of investment, whether it's in manufacturing or research development inside their country. According to the study that we conducted with the Boston Consulting Group, we found that growth in semiconductor manufacturing capacity is projected to grow by 56% through 2030. And if the U.S. does not take action to ensure that it has a more competitive environment to offset some of its cost disadvantages, that the U.S. will only see 6% of that growth happen inside the United States. So that would be what would happen if the U.S. didn't take action, is simply less fabs will be built in the United States and those fabs will be built elsewhere. And our hope is that the U.S. can think really hard about how can the U.S. be more competitive. And again, we think the answer is to use smart tax and grant policy to help semiconductor companies. Doesn't matter if they're American, if they're Japanese, if they're Korean, any semiconductor company that wants to come to the United States to invest in a new fabrication facility, we think should be able to qualify for those type of incentives. So we also think that the United States needs to have a global outlook, and it needs to support and embrace global partners to build and be part of the U.S. semiconductor ecosystem. We think that that would be a tremendous success. As you mentioned, TSMC has announced intention to build a fab in the United States in Arizona. There's reports that Samsung too is interested in building an advanced node logic foundry potentially in the United States. That would be a huge win for the United States. We think that the U.S. should welcome investment from U.S. and foreign semiconductor companies because, as I mentioned, there's no one company or country that can do everything on its own. And I think the U.S. government should recognize this, and rather than focus on investing in areas where other countries may have a really strong expertise in, we should work with those companies in foreign countries and regions and partner with them to build a stronger global supply chain that's inside the United States and in conjunction with other nations as well. If you think about it, an advanced new fab that we built in the United States or anywhere in the world also requires a global supply chain. Some of the advanced materials come from Germany or Japan for the photoresist. Some of the advanced manufacturing tools to build chips come from the Netherlands or Japan, the United States. And the engineers themselves are global, coming from all different countries with amazing backgrounds to help design and develop the manufacturing process. And then the manufacturing itself happens in multiple different countries, from front-end manufacturing to assembly, test, finally to consumption by the end user. Again, that's a really global activity. And even if a company like TSMC were to build a fab in the United States, it's still going to require a global supply chain for it to operate. And that's not a bad thing. That's the amazing aspect of our industry, is this deep global supply chain that makes us more efficient. It's important to remember that in the semiconductor industry, the government has long played an important role, but it's not the decisive role. The decisive role is still going to be played by the market, technology, good management products that are going to help companies be successful or maybe even fail in the market. But what governments can do is provide an environment that promotes innovation. And there's a lot of different factors. It's not just about providing incentives for manufacturing, but it's also having a more holistic strategic approach that includes creating a fair marketplace, enforcing competition laws, protecting intellectual property, investing in universities and the workforce so that there's smart people that can go work for semiconductor companies worldwide. It's also promoting trade and strengthening the global semiconductor value chain because these products are made across dozens of countries, and it requires collaboration and cooperation between a lot of different partners. But in addition, we think a proper role of government is also to help promote growth in the industry. And that has to be done in a careful and balanced way, because on the one hand, while it's important to promote that growth through things like limited grants or tax incentives to help promote the growth of domestic firms, we also don't want too heavy a hand of the government that might lead to things like overcapacity or intervention in the market in a way that might alter the competitive outcomes. Again, it's really about how does a government create that environment where it can foster organic growth within its borders. And one really important thing, as we see, for example, the European Union, you mentioned, is looking at investing in the microelectronics industry with a small group of countries. South Korea recently has prioritized, for example, AI semiconductors and advanced semiconductor materials. Even Japan is looking at, for example, investing in semiconductor advanced packaging. One really important factor is that we have to realize that no one company and no one government can have an entirely self-sufficient semiconductor supply chain within its own borders. This industry is just too complex, too globally distributed, and built upon these amazing global value chains that the cost and the inefficiency that it would create and trying to build all of that inside your borders is just impractical. And the U.S. semiconductor industry does not support, reshoring of entire semiconductor supply chains, nor do we support decoupling from the global value chain or the Chinese semiconductor value chain, because we all need to be integrated, work together to have efficiency so that we can build better, smaller, faster chips for our consumers and customers. I think after COVID-19, in fact, it's the opposite. More governments realize the strategic importance of having resilient supply chains. Last year when multiple governments were going into lockdown to try and contain the pandemic, there was a shortage of supplies across the world, from personal protective equipment to ventilators to help people battle COVID inside the hospitals, to critical medical equipment like masks and protective face shields, so that hospital personnel would be able to protect themselves from the pandemic as well. And so that really, I think, was a wake-up call for a lot of governments, that for some very strategic supplies, if they're overly concentrated perhaps in one region, there needs to be perhaps some smart investments to help sort of redistribute where maybe some of that activity happens. Again, that doesn't mean that government should decouple from the global supply chain, that they should onshore everything. That's impossible. As I mentioned, no one company or country is able to do the entirety of the semiconductor supply chain on its own. But again, I think what the pandemic has reinforced for policymakers and capitals from Beijing to Brussels to Washington is that they need to have some smarter policies to help manage the risks. And in fact, the European Union has prioritized no less than 20% of their COVID recovery funding for the digital economy, and that includes semiconductors as well. In the United States, you're seeing just this week, President Biden hold a microchip in his hands and talk about how important it is to have a resilient domestic semiconductor supply chain here in the United States as well. Not yet. As we understand it, and what I've read from the public media, is that the initial 1.9 trillion COVID recovery package, which again, that's still under negotiation between the White House, the House, and the Senate here in Washington, D.C. So a lot of the details are not yet final, and they're still being negotiated amongst the political parties. But our understanding is that that investment will be focused primarily on the more immediate and urgent priorities of containing the pandemic, increasing testing for COVID-19, expanding the number of vaccinations that U.S. citizens are able to access, and also providing more economic aid to small businesses, to workers who may have lost their job during the pandemic. So right now, the focus of that $1.9 trillion stimulus package is really on the short-term issues related to the pandemic, and it's probably not likely to include issues such as supply chains and domestic infrastructure. But there are other opportunities for semiconductor-related funding. As I mentioned, President Biden has been talking about a Build Back Better agenda, where he wants to use investment from the U.S. government to spur new things like smart infrastructure, new roads, bridges, and maybe even digital infrastructure to help find new sources of economic growth for the United States. And it seems like there's a lot of support actually in the U.S. Congress for those kind of investments. Yeah, well, this is really an amazing but also very challenging time for the semiconductor industry. We're in a kind of once in a century pandemic, and that's really created a number of disruptions to the supply chain, but also to the supply and demand balance. If you look back to last year, when because of the pandemic, governments and countries were going into lockdown and there were supply chain disruptions, economic activity fell off a cliff, and we were going into an economic crisis. But as people readjusted to the new normal of the COVID economy of stay-at-home learning, stay-at-home work, people started ordering all sorts of new displays for their home, new TVs, new iPads, new speakers. And so actually demand for semiconductors increased significantly, even during the backdrop of COVID-19. Or, for example, data centers to power all the e-commerce that was being used to deliver, important goods to people's doorsteps or download and watch more movies at home. Unfortunately, a lot of the auto manufacturing plants were not able to recover as quickly. And it's because of that, many of them canceled orders for their semiconductor chips and wafers. And that led to a huge decline in demand from auto semiconductors last year. At the end of last year, though, fortunately, demand started picking up for cars. But as I mentioned, supply in semiconductors was already very constrained because of this huge demand for the stay-at-home and the COVID economy. So what that meant is that semiconductor foundries and fabs all over the world were running at really high utilization. I think average utilization across the foundries is above 95% right now. And to think about that, on average, 80% utilization is already what we call a fully loaded fab. So, these fabs really didn't have any more capacity they could add to meet that short-term sudden increase in demand from the automakers. So what that led to is a bit of a temporary shortage that we're seeing right now. And, the good news is that things are going to get better. That we're seeing some positive developments in terms of, companies increase their yield, their efficiency, their output. And, it takes time for companies to build a new chip. You can't just flip a switch and produce a chip. It takes 2 to 3 months, if not longer, to build a chip. And for companies who are going to add new capacity, increase their utilization, it adds another 6 months on top of that. So, again, this is going to sort itself out. The market is going to be able to correct, and semiconductor companies are working really hard to meet that demand. But it's just going to take a little bit of time. Certainly, some of the natural phenomenon that we've seen, like these snowstorms in Texas or an earthquake in Japan, that's going to only make it a little bit worse. But the good news is the semiconductor industry is actually fairly resilient. And, we've seen floods in Thailand, earthquakes in Japan, and the semiconductor industry has learned to be able to cope with these natural disasters and come back online very quickly. In fact, some of the semiconductor fabs are built to withstand earthquakes, tsunamis, have backup power generation. I think the good news is that already we're seeing a number of those semiconductor plants in Texas already seeing their power restored. So I think that was more of a short-term blip, but certainly it doesn't help. But the good news again is I think we're seeing some positive signs that this auto chip shortage may be over in a couple of quarters. We're seeing good positive news out of Chinese Taipei. We're seeing good news out of the United States and Germany. And so again, I think most analysts predict that in 1 or 2 quarters, maybe by the summer, we're going to see a pretty positive turnaround in this auto chip shortage situation. In the past, there's been some severe disruptions to the supply chain during the tsunami that wiped out a significant amount of semiconductor production in northern Japan. Earlier in the 1990s, there was an explosion at a Japanese semiconductor chemicals company that led to a huge increase in prices and memory and DRAM. So certainly the industry, because this is a global supply chain, has its challenges. But again, we've been able to overcome, and the industry's figured out how to manage some of these issues. So I think while certainly natural disasters is something that is a risk to the industry, so far we have a good track record of managing those risks.